If you've played D&D, you're probably sick of elves by now. But if you're an anime fan, judging by all the elf-related content we're getting right now, you probably can't get enough of them. Elves are undergoing a bit of a renaissance as of late, with several elves of all varieties taking center stage. Now granted, elves have always had a role in anime, but the last few years have seen manga and their anime adaptations bringing elves to the forefront of fantasy lore. While elves remain a core part of fantasy literature, they've been demystified somewhat since the days of Tolkien, but anime elves seem intent on demystifying themselves even further. Sometimes they're ethereal entities of great power, other times they're tragic figures that exist on the fringes of society, and other times they're colossal dorks, but let's just get into this. The modern elf can be traced to Tolkien, as most fantasy can be. Middle-earth's elves remain some of the most pure and ethereal entities in his world. It is from Tolkien that we see the various sub-races of elves manifest, from the High Elves to the Wood Elves to the Avari, or Dark Elves. Also Sea Elves. Tolkien gave us Sea Elves. I wish we could have seen that shown up in Lord of the Rings, or maybe Sea Elves would have made Rings of Power better, but what can you do?
Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.
Tolkien also conceptualized the idea of fallen elves in the form of orcs. For more details, watch my video on evil races. I go into more detail about orcs there. A quote from The Hobbit illustrates Tolkien's elves. In the wide world, the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars, and they wandered in the great forests that grew tall in lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of the world, from which they could escape at times to hunt, or to ride and run over the open land by moonlight or stars. And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the gloaming and the dusk. Still elves they were and remain, and that is good people. Fantasy writers would go on to use elves in their work, such as Terry Brooks' Shannara series, but Dungeons & Dragons would allow players to embody all their elf fantasies. It didn't take long for elves to become popular in Japan. Legend of Zelda may not explicitly call the Hylians elves, but they are high elves in all but name, much like how the Kokiri are wood elves and the Moblins are orcs. Legend of Zelda did a lot to bring elves down to earth. They can grow old, die, and many do not possess the same incredible magical power that Tolkien's High Elves did.
We rely on your knight, and that legendary sword he carries.
Record of Lodoss War is heavily inspired by the TTRPG Sword World, which itself was heavily inspired by D&D. For many years, this anime and the Slayers held dominion over anime fantasy fandom, though nowadays when people think of the 90s fantasy anime, they think of Berserk, which, you know what, fair. But Lodoss War was fantastic too, and I want to talk about it. Deedlit is the sole female elf in the primary adventuring party of the original Record of Lodoss War. She's incredibly powerful, and incredibly mischievous. There's something honestly so beautiful about how elves look in Lodoss War. I don't think they've ever looked better since then. This is the peak of elf design in anime. While the show was overall fantastic, Deedlit had the entire fandom in a chokehold. She's so popular that decades later, she ended up starring in the Metroidvania game Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth. But these are just a few noteworthy elves. There are so many who showed up before and after, and some fictional races that bear striking resemblance to elves in all but name. Puck, one of the first characters we meet in the Berserk manga, is an elf, though he more resembles a fairy by our modern convention. Others include Chi from Chobits. The Persicoms do have elf-like ears that function as inputs, after all. Also Elfen Lied, which doesn't have any real elves in it, but I mean, it's called Elfen Lied, and the Diclonius have those pointy horns that kind of look like ears. I have to mention this somewhere, if only to remind you that the opening song of that anime is still amazing.
Just try to be careful. Look, I'll be fine. It just has to be cut up, right?
But with the rise of both fantasy harems and isekai anime, elves saw a huge resurgence. Some of these elves are really well written, while others are just girls with pointed ears. Some characters, like Emilia from ReZero, are really interesting characters with a lot of depth and personality, but the fact that she's an elf, does that factor a ton into her character? She has incredible magical power and is long-lived, but the ethereal, otherworldly disconnect we see in elves like Deedlit or the Tolkien elves just isn't there. She's a great character, but is she a great elf? That's the problem with elves in media. The more normalized they become, the less otherworldly they are. As elf girls become more popular, they appear more frequently, and new writers explore them, sometimes in new, creative, and kind of weird ways. And I want to focus on 3 elves from recent anime that I feel really highlight the creative ways anime can explore elves. And my hot take of the video is that the 3rd elf is just as interesting in the greater conversation as the first 2, but we're not ready to talk about that yet. Delicious in Dungeons, Marcille Donato is essentially a magical powerhouse. She's a bookworm mage that doesn't always seem to understand the extreme cost of her own magical power. She's skittish, excitable, and sometimes a picky eater when it comes to dungeon delving. Many elves are defined in early literature by their division from society, being ethereal, floating outside of normal human relationships. Not Marcille. She's emotional and passionate about her friends. She is motivated by wanting to support the members of her party. She sees them as family, and she loves them. She values other people. And in part, that's due to the knowledge that everything around her will someday pass on. As a half-elf, she has an extremely long life, twice as long as the average elf, and that terrifies her, because she deeply cares for all of her friends, but knows one day they'll all die and she'll live on. And that's a fate seen by our second example. Frieren is arguably one of the most popular elves in the current anime landscape, and there's a reason for that. She's an incredibly layered character whose long life has distanced herself from ordinary people. It's not that she's so old she doesn't care. It's that she's so old she thinks a decade is a brief period of time. Her perception has been distorted by age. Spending 50 years studying spells is a trifle to her, but a lifetime for those who she cares about and who care about her. While Himmel, a companion who joined Run a Quest to stop Demon King, saw Frieren as one of his dearest friends, 10 years of their travels was just too brief a time for Frieren to really know him. She's a person who lives life to a different beat, and the world is constantly speeding past her. This existential tragedy is honestly heartbreaking to watch, because while everything around her ages and fades, she remains a constant. It's a story that really knows how to use elves and their long lives as a plot point. That's compelling and heartbreaking. You feel Frieren's ethereal nature, but you also understand her, and that really grounds the tragedy of her situation. Both Marcille and Frieren are elves that are impacted by their extended lifespan. For Frieren, she tries to learn how to appreciate the world around her with such a long life, while Marcille fears losing everything she adores. However, we see the impact of long life on elves throughout Delicious in Dungeon, though it manifests very differently than in Frieren. While Frieren shows the titular elf struggling to form human relationships, elves in Delicious in Dungeon tend to treat the shorter-lived races around them less as people and more like pets or a second-class citizen. This can get very difficult when, say, someone's foster mother starts treating them less as a child and more as a lovely pet, or failing to connect with the emotional needs of someone going through trauma, because for an elf, all trauma seems so small for these short-lived people. It's also this distance that makes Marcille, by comparison, so fascinating, because it's clear she is forming very intense relationships, even though she's going to live so long that the elves around her may feel like fleeting memories. It's the impending existential horror that drives her. There's a tragic dichotomy here that really shows the ways you can cleverly use the lore of elves to tell compelling, fully realized characters. And then there's Elfuda. Yeah, this is my hot take. Get ready for this one. Plus-sized elf is by no means compelling fantasy literature. I don't even know if it's good, honestly, especially compared to Frieren and Delicious in Dungeons. But I mean, it's getting an anime adaptation soon, so I suppose it kind of counts in this discussion. And I already had this scripted, and I rushed the script because I knew the anime adaptation was coming out, so bear with me here, guys.
What are you, stupid?
Look, it's not like we haven't had silly elf stories before. Otaku Elf did much the same thing, and that came out last year. And that's focusing on an elf who's a shut-in, who was worshipped at a shrine, because she got teased once about 6 years ago by her ears and never got over it. But plus-size elf, I feel, goes the extra mile above and beyond by completely inverting every single trope about elves possible. And it is in this sense that I think Elfuda is fascinating from a literary critical standpoint. And yes, this is where I try to academically apply theory to plus-sized elf. I have a degree, I gotta use it somewhere. So elves, right? They're wayfish, ethereal beings that exist beyond our mortal realm. So naturally, Elfuda is a hedonistic glutton who loves potatoes and is too lazy to lose weight, and exists entirely for the physical reality around her. A complete inversion. Now, Elfuda cannot return home until she's lost weight, because apparently the portal to the fantasy world is like, I guess, like it's like a Winnie the Pooh situation. I don't know, what are you gonna do? So, monster harem with body diversity. That's cool. All the elves we mentioned previously have pursued knowledge in some way, to their own detriment. Frieren pursued knowledge and squandered the little time she had left with her companions. Marcel saw nothing wrong with delving into ancient blood magic, sacrificing aspects of her personhood in the process. Even Deedlit's mischievous nature got the party in trouble. The only thing with Elfuda is that her vice has a physical consequence. It's not spiritual or abstract, it's material. She's in love with food, and thus can't fit into the portal going back to Fantasy World. It can't be more straightforward than that. She's pursuing earthly delights, and this is the consequence. But like many other elves, she also pursues the knowledge necessary to remedy her problem, though she's far from disciplined. Elfuda wouldn't be in this predicament if she had a more grounded understanding of humanity, like Emilia does. She's so distant from reality that she doesn't see the harm in doing what she does, and ends up trapped. And that's pretty absurd, but it's an interesting take we don't see on elves ever, that their ignorance and detachment from humanity can be their own undoing. And that's one thing about anime elves I think are very interesting. They can put them in scenarios that Tolkien would never dream of, because I don't think Tolkien would ever put his elves even a mile within processed foods. At this point in time, the anime elf renaissance isn't about making elves cool. I already told you, design-wise we peaked with Lodoss War. It's all about using the concepts in interesting and creative ways. And all three of these elves I just mentioned are creative. So we have some good years ahead of us if this keeps up. So let's not squander them arguing over which elf is best, because it's clearly favorite.